There once was a king who had everything: wealth, palaces, power, except for one thing: a son to pass it all on to. The king grew obsessed with his lack of a male heir, and would let nothing or no one stand in his way from obtaining one. Woman after woman he would marry, wife after wife used as a means to an end. One king, 6 queens. This is their story. As with any good tale, our story begins with a conflict. The Wars of the Roses was a decades-long clash between 2 opposing houses, Lancaster and York. The grand prize for all this trouble was the highly coveted English throne. The rivalry between the 2 houses brewed and festered for over 30 years. The battles were few, but when combat did occur, the loss of human life was immense. And it all came to a head at the Battle of Bosworth. On one side were the Yorkists, fighting for their reigning king, Richard III, and on the other side were the Lancastrians, who fought for Henry Tudor, a nobleman with less than ideal claims to the throne. At the end of the day, the result was definite. Richard III was killed on the battlefield, and Henry Tudor emerged victorious. England's new king, Henry VII, was crowned at Westminster Abbey, and soon after married Elizabeth of York, uniting the 2 factions York and Lancaster, and creating the House of Tudor. On the 28th of June, 1491, the Queen gave birth to a healthy baby boy, a little prince christened Henry after his father. However, Prince Henry was never meant to be king. Rather, it was little Henry's older brother, Prince Arthur, who was destined to inherit their father's crown. As the Wars of the Roses had shown, power and politics were fickle things in the Age of Kings. A ruler could be deposed in the blink of an eye, a lesson Henry VII knew all too well. England's first Tudor king needed to solidify his position. His family tree possessed little royal blood, which made his claim to the throne weak and left him in a vulnerable position. Henry VII needed allies, and what better way to form alliances than through marriage? Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were the ultimate power couple of their day. Both monarchs in their own right, Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage had united a formerly divided Spain and created a nation that was a real force to be reckoned with. An alliance with such a powerful nation, a union between his heir and a daughter of Spain, was just the thing King Henry needed. And so, as toddlers, Prince Arthur was betrothed to Ferdinand and Isabella's youngest daughter, Catalina. Years passed, and when Arthur and Catalina came of age, it was decided that the 2 should marry. The Spanish princess, just shy of 16, set sail for England. She would never see her family or her homeland ever again. On the 14th of November, 1501, Arthur and Catalina, now known as Katherine, married in spectacular fashion, a wedding befitting a future king and queen of England. In this moment, the Tudor dynasty seemed secure. Unfortunately, just months into their marriage, Arthur and Katherine became desperately ill. Katherine would survive, but her husband would not. Prince Arthur, England's heir and future king, died at the tender age of 15. Poor Katherine was now in limbo. The princess found herself, a teenaged widow, in a strange land and without family. Her role as Princess of Wales and future royal consort had died along with her husband, and no one quite knew what to do with her. Should she be sent back to Spain? Should she stay in England? Or some other alternative? One option was to marry Katherine to the new heir to the English throne, Arthur's little brother, Prince Henry. This proposition came with a couple of complications, though. For one, Henry was still a young boy at this time. and was too young to marry and produce heirs. The second problem regarded the legitimacy of Catherine and Arthur's marriage. England, at this time, was an extremely devout Catholic nation and closely adhered to Christian teachings. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21, the passage states, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall remain childless." The first problem, that of Prince Henry's age, would be remedied with time. But as to the interpretation of the biblical passage, whether or not Henry would be marrying his dead brother's widow was a much more delicate matter. It would be up to the Pope, Catholicism's earthly authority, to decide on the legality of the marriage between Arthur and Catherine. Such legality, the legitimacy of the marriage, all hindered upon the question of whether or not Catherine and Arthur had consummated the marriage. This proved difficult to ascertain. After the couple's first night together, Arthur had insinuated that the two had been intimate. Catherine, later on, swore that they had not. In the end, the Pope gave his dispensation, and the betrothal of Prince Henry and Catherine went forward. The royals would be married in 2 years' time, once Henry had reached his 14th birthday. However, in 1504, Catherine's mother, Queen Isabella of Castile, died. This, besides being terribly sad for Catherine, threw a great wrench into the betrothal agreement. When Henry VII had agreed for his new heir to marry the child of Ferdinand and Isabella, he was promised an alliance with a powerful and unified Spain. With Queen Isabella gone, Spain was once more divided, and Catherine's political connections were not as appealing to King Henry as they once were. So, Prince Henry's 14th birthday came and went, and the wedding did not occur. For over 4 years, Catherine's future would hang in the balance. Her father Ferdinand and her former father-in-law squabbled over her dowry, and the latter attempted to find an alternative bride for his son, in case the betrothal with Catherine shouldn't pan out. These were especially sad and difficult times for the young princess, but soon her life would change forever. On the 21st of April, 1509, after a long battle with tuberculosis, King Henry VII died. The heavy burden of kingship was now placed upon the shoulders of his 17-year-old son. In the years after Arthur's death, Prince Henry's admiration and affection grew for his former sister-in-law. The Spanish princess was pretty, pious, and dignified. So, it came as no surprise that after the death of his father, Henry made his intentions to marry Catherine. In June 1509, Henry and Catherine were wed and crowned king and queen in a joint coronation ceremony. Subjects rejoiced and celebrated their new sovereign. With such promise, so began the reign of Henry VIII. Although images of a gluttonous ogre tend to spring to mind when we think of Henry VIII, it certainly didn't start out that way. In his youth, Henry was a strikingly good-looking man, some contemporaries describing him as beautiful, with delicate features, bright blue eyes, and golden red hair. The king stood at 6 feet 2 and towered over his subjects, his body made strong and slim from vigorous athletic pursuits. As for his personality, Henry was a Renaissance man in every sense of the phrase. He loved sports like hunting, jousting, and tennis. He was highly intelligent, with great aptitude in the sciences, philosophy, religion, and also possessed great talent as a musician and dancer. England's future must have looked bright with such a formidable young man on the throne. From the moment Henry and Catherine became husband and wife, Queen Catherine's ultimate duty was to produce an heir, preferably a male one, and soon. Unlike today, the physicians and expectant mothers of Tudor times were not privy to the miracles of modern medicine. No ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, and no way of ensuring a safe delivery of a child. Even if a baby survived its birth, there was a 14% chance that the child would die before its first birthday. Throughout her lifetime, Katherine would become pregnant at least half a dozen times, the pregnancies always resulting in heartbreak and disappointment, save for one surviving child. But it was not the son the king desired. It was a girl, a princess, christened Mary, born on the 18th of February, 1516. By 1524, 15 years into their marriage, Katherine was well past the age of bearing children. Nearing her 40s, the queen's many pregnancies and miscarriages had left her old and haggard in appearance. The king now found the act of sleeping with his wife distasteful and no longer shared her bed. Henry, as kings were prone to do, had mistresses throughout his marriage to Katherine. One of these affairs even resulted in a healthy son that the king happily recognized as his own. This child proved, in Henry's mind, that he was more than capable of siring healthy male children, just not with his wife. Henry's mind was troubled. The Tudor dynasty was still very young, and the lack of a male heir left it vulnerable. Henry grew paranoid. Anything could happen. A coup, a foreign uprising, the king's own death. He began to think the unthinkable, ending his marriage with Katherine of Aragon. As mentioned before, England was a Catholic nation, and divorce, according to Catholicism, was an absolute no-no. But something pivotal to understanding Henry VIII is that what Henry wants, Henry gets. When Henry and Katherine were first wed, the Pope had given permission to do so, saying that even though Henry was marrying his dead brother's wife, it wasn't technically a bad thing, because Katherine and Arthur never consummated the marriage. But what if the Pope had been wrong? What if the marriage between Henry and Katherine was an unclean thing? And if the marriage was not a legitimate thing in the first place, then what should prevent the king from taking a new wife? As these questions swirled in the king's mind, Henry would begin a passionate relationship that would be the final nail in the coffin that was his marriage, a romance that would change history. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a landowner and courtier, and his wife Elizabeth, a member of the esteemed Howard family. Anne's actual birth date is not known, but historians believe it was sometime around 1501 and 1507. Anne grew up at Hever Castle in Kent, along with her sister Mary and brother George. As a young lady, she was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria to wait upon the Archduchess as a maid of honor. During her stint abroad, Anne became fluent in French and was introduced to the ways of court life. After serving Margaret of Austria, Anne was sent to France to act as maid of honor to Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister and the King of France's new wife. When the old French king died, Anne's services were then transferred to the new Queen Claude. During her time at the French court, Anne honed her razor-sharp wit and adopted French fashions. So, when Anne joined the English court as one of Katherine of Aragon's attendants, she made quite the impression. An English girl with French ways, she must have appeared exotic. Combined with her intelligence and charm, it's no wonder Anne excelled in her new position. Interestingly enough, Henry VIII's list of prior mistresses included one Mary Boleyn, Anne's own sister. Mary had caught the wandering eye of the king when she and Anne first came to court in 1522. They began an affair, and though the king was a passionate paramour, his intense desires always cooled once the object of his infatuation gave him what he desired, and Mary Boleyn was no exception. Anne witnessed firsthand how easily the king's fervor transformed into apathy. Anne, unlike her sister, would not make this mistake when the king set his gaze upon her. Henry sent Anne gifts and letters, and the letters which survive today reveal a man absolutely infatuated. And what of Queen Catherine's feelings toward Henry and his latest flame? Well, she did as many queens and wives had done before. She turned a blind eye. The queen was no fool, however. Of course she was aware of her husband's affairs. Women came, women went, and only the queen remained. Surely this mistress, this Anne Boleyn, would be no different. Sadly for Catherine, she couldn't have been more wrong. In 1527, Henry VIII set in motion what would be known as the King's Great Matter, a plan to formally separate from his wife and to make Anne Boleyn his new queen. Henry turned to his advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, for counsel. The cardinal then proceeded to convene private sessions with England's canonical heavyweights. They all soon realized, however, the gravity of this monumental task, and it was agreed upon that the King's Great Matter must be sent to Rome. It was not long before Queen Catherine heard stirrings of her husband's desire to be rid of her. She was utterly devastated by the revelation. Rather than sit idly by, though, Catherine wrote to her most powerful ally, her nephew, Charles V, to plead for his help and support. The king's once private affairs were now on the public stage and a hot topic in the realm of international diplomacy. In 1528, the Pope sent a legate, or special ambassador, to England to deal with the King's Great Matter. The King and Anne were optimistic that the winds of change would soon blow in their favor. The trial took place in the summer of 1529, and Henry and Catherine were called to the court to present their cases. The king voiced his doubts on the validity of his marriage, declaring that his conscience was disturbed for having lived in sin for the last 20 years with his dead brother's wife. When the king had finished speaking, the queen threw herself at her husband's feet. She begged the king for justice, asking what she had done to deserve to be treated in this way. Catherine asserted that she and the king's brother were never intimate, and that her heart and her body had only ever belonged to Henry, her true husband. The queen was resolute in her defense, and no conclusion was made. The trial went nowhere, and the case was recalled to Rome. It was after this fiasco of a trial that Henry began to consider options for an annulment that did not involve the Pope or the Church. In the meantime, Anne Boleyn was queen in all but name. The king showered her with gifts and treated her like a proper queen consort. Queen Catherine, on the other hand, was moved from the royal court to live effectively in exile. To add insult to injury, Henry decided to separate Catherine from their 12-year-old daughter, Princess Mary. Mary, Catherine's only living child, was the apple of her mother's eye. Keeping Catherine away from her daughter was especially cruel on the king's part, and left the queen in complete isolation. Catherine and Mary would never see each other again. By 1531, Henry was convinced that obtaining an annulment from Rome was a lost cause, and decided the solution would be found much closer to home. It was in this year that Henry started proceedings to separate his realm from Rome and to make himself the head of a new Church of England. This new church would still be essentially Catholic, but it would be King Henry, not the Pope, who would be recognized as spiritual sovereign. The king, as supreme head of his own church, could then grant himself his long-desired annulment. This plan, England separating from Rome, would be politically explosive, and England needed friends to offset the inevitable backlash. Henry turned to his occasional rival, the French King Francis, for his support in his marriage to Anne. King Francis did give his support, and the alliance between the two kings was sealed with a meeting at Calais. It is generally believed by historians that during their time in Calais, Anne and Henry consummated their relationship. Henry and Catherine's marriage was not officially annulled, but Henry was so confident he would get an annulment that on the 25th of January, 1533, in a small secret ceremony, King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were married. When the couple exchanged their vows, Anne was likely expecting their first child. After years of frustration and desperation for a son, the king's great matter was coming to a close, and Henry finally had reason to hope. That summer, Anne was crowned Queen of England in style. She was escorted by barge along the Thames to the Tower of London and was taken to Westminster Abbey for her coronation. Just as Henry had moved heaven and earth to make Anne his wife, Anne was also keeping her side of the bargain. In August, Queen Anne took to her chamber. Confinement was a practice performed by upper-class women prior to childbirth, when the mother-to-be would stay in her bedchamber, shutting out all but her female attendants until after the birth of her child. On the 7th of September, 1533, Anne's labor pains began. By that afternoon, the new queen had delivered a healthy baby, but much to the disappointment of her parents, the baby was not a boy, as the royal astrologers and physicians had predicted, but a girl. Although the king was let down by the child's sex, the king was still optimistic. If he and Anne could produce one healthy child, the little brothers would surely follow. In the meantime, a law was passed that it would be Henry's children with Anne, not his daughter with Catherine, that were the rightful heirs to the English throne. Mary's title of princess was taken from her, as her new baby half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, took precedence. A parchment was delivered to Katherine of Aragon, declaring the validity of the king's marriage to Anne, and that it would be best if Catherine would give in and accept the new and lesser title of Princess Dowager. Catherine was unshakable and declared to the messengers that she was still the queen and the king's true wife. Back at court, Anne reveled in her new daughter. Her marriage, on the other hand, grew more and more strained. In addition to the disappointment of Princess Elizabeth's birth, Henry and Anne's great love affair had cooled. Henry continued to have affairs, and unlike Queen Catherine, who looked the other way when the king would stray, Queen Anne simply would not have it. The couple kept up a cheerful charade for appearance's sake, but cracks were beginning to show in the royal marriage. Anne conceived soon after the birth of Elizabeth, and was visibly pregnant by the spring of 1534. Before Anne had a chance to go into confinement, she experienced complications, and the baby was delivered either prematurely or stillborn. Anne's world around her was collapsing, and Catherine fared no better. She had spent the majority of her banishment being shuffled around from one run-down abode to another. Catherine's separation from her daughter, Henry's ill treatment, and the damp, dilapidated places in which she was forced to stay had contributed and advanced the queen's poor health and unhappiness. In the summer of 1535, Anne suffered another stillbirth. This and her husband's extramarital affairs were causing Anne great anxiety. History was repeating itself. England's queen, unable to produce living children, and England's king, developing feelings for a woman who was not his wife. Jane Seymour was lady-in-waiting to both Queen Catherine and Queen Anne, and was now King Henry's newest female companion. Jane Seymour was Anne Boleyn's opposite in every way. Where Anne's features were dark and sensual, Jane's were fair and rather plain. Where Anne was feisty and forthright, Jane was meek and mild. Anne's tempestuous ways had been exciting and attractive during their courtship, but as his wife and queen, the king found her tiresome. As Henry was in the midst of another romance, Catherine was making her will. Years of sadness and strain had taken their toll on the queen, and her final days grew near. Before her passing, Catherine dictated one final letter to the man at the heart of her suffering. My lord and dear husband, the hour of my death draweth fast. The tender love I owe you forceth me with a few words to put you in remembrance of the health and safeguard of your soul. You have cast me into many miseries, and yourself into many cares. For my part, I do pardon you. For the rest, I commend unto you Mary, our daughter, beseeching you to be a good father unto her. Lastly, I vow that mine eyes desire you above all things." From the moment she left Spain, decades before, Catherine had firmly believed queenship to be her destiny. She had survived her husband's cruelty and public humiliation with pride and dignity, and had loved him regardless. On the 7th of January, 1536, Katherine of Aragon, Queen of England, died. As English subjects somberly lined the streets to mourn their beloved queen, Henry and Anne expressed relief in her passing. Anne was cheerful, not just because her main rival was gone, but also she was pregnant again. Anne knew she was quickly losing the king's good graces, and his focus had turned to others. It was her hope that a male child, Henry's longed-for heir, would rekindle Henry's affections for her. Surely this time she would bring the baby to term. A few months into the pregnancy, Anne caught Henry with Mr. Seymour. Anne flew into a rage, and Henry, worried about the baby she was carrying, attempted to pacify her. However, it made no difference. Later that evening, Anne did miscarry, the baby positively identified as a boy. For Henry, this was the final straw. Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed. Once again, Henry turned to his advisors to find a way to get rid of his wife. Unlike the previous time, annulment was not an option. So, Thomas Cromwell, the king's secretary, set to getting the king out of his marriage. The royal courts of yore, much like the typical small town, were hotbeds of rumor and gossip. As Cromwell dug for dirt and sniffed for clues, he soon discovered that it would be this rumor mill that would help tighten the proverbial noose around Anne Boleyn's neck. The tales that Cromwell gathered from spies under his direction and interviews with women in Anne's royal household culminated in a poorly supported portrait which painted Queen Anne as an adulteress. Cromwell was able to pin down a group of the Queen's supposed lovers. Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton were all gentlemen of the King's Privy Chamber. Mark Smeaton was a court musician, and most shockingly of all, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, was also accused of having a salacious affair with Anne. Of all the accused, only one, Mark Smeaton, would confess to any wrongdoing, but it was likely this was done under duress. As May commenced, King Henry and Queen Anne oversaw the May Day tournament in Greenwich. Henry suddenly withdrew during the proceedings and rode back to London, leaving Anne bewildered. Little did she know this is the last time she would ever see her husband. The following day, Anne was summoned before the King's Privy Council. Upon her entrance, the Queen was informed of the charges against her: treason, adultery, and incest. She was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. A mere 3 years before, Anne had been rowed to the Tower in great splendor, in celebration of her coronation. Now, as Anne exited the barge and made her way up the steps to her imprisonment, she fell to her knees and prayed for God's deliverance. Inside the royal apartments of the Tower, the Queen roamed about, her mood swinging hysterically from crying to laughter, then back again. On the day of her trial, Anne was escorted into the Tower's great hall. The jury consisted of English noblemen, and the proceedings were presided over by Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. The trial, though, was just for show. Anne Boleyn was guilty before she had even set foot in that courtroom. She stood, dignified, as each member of the jury declared her guilty and sentenced her to die. Once the sentencing had commenced, Anne, surprisingly calm, professed her innocence. She admitted that although she had faults, the charges against her were false. But as it should please the king for her to die, she was content in doing so. As Anne awaited to meet her Maker, She was informed that by the king's grace she would be beheaded by an experienced executioner rather than being burned at the stake. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne walked the short distance to the scaffold on Tower Green. With a calm demeanor, she stood before the crowd and spoke her final words. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to the law, and therefore will speak nothing against it. I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly to the will of the King, my Lord. I pray and beseech you all to pray for the life of the King, who has always treated me so well. Wherefore I submit to death with good will, humbly asking for pardon of all the world. If any person should meddle with my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." Anne Boleyn then kneeled on the scaffold, and with one stroke of the executioner's sword, was beheaded. Cannons fired to signal the death of the now late Queen Anne Boleyn. King Henry, now a free man, hastily made his way to be by his mistress Jane Seymour's side. 11 days later, Henry and Jane were married. After the torrential end of the king's second marriage, the calm which came from the inception of his third was a welcome change to many at court, especially for those who belonged to the anti-Anne Boleyn faction. Jane behaved in every way the model Tudor wife. She was quiet and obedient, and while she, like Anne, was pious, Jane's leanings were much closer to Queen Catherine's ideals rather than Anne's progressive notions. Early on in their marriage, Jane made it her mission to reunite Henry with his estranged daughter Mary. Now an adult, Mary had not seen her father in years, their relationship strained due to the king's marriage to Anne, and Mary's refusal to recognize it. Still, Jane persisted, and after much prodding, the king was persuaded, and Mary became a familiar face at court. Jane was playing with fire in her defense of Lady Mary. Her husband was more than willing to dispose of his wives, and Jane's position was not yet a sure thing. However, in the spring of 1537, Jane received news that would make her position unequivocally secure. Henry's newest queen was expecting their first child. Nearly 3 decades and 3 wives later, on the 27th of October, 1537, Henry finally had the healthy, legitimate heir he so desired, a prince christened Edward. But as the king and the country rejoiced, events would soon take a dark turn. Jane Seymour had experienced 2 days of agonizing labor with Edward, and had fallen seriously ill with puerperal fever, a postpartum infection contracted during childbirth. Jane's condition continued to worsen, and just under 2 weeks after the birth of her son, the Queen died in her sleep. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. I also have an Instagram you can follow, and make sure to check out my Patreon for more exclusive content. See you soon!